Welcome everyone to Digging Deeper number 23. Tonight we continue in Jesus' Halakha, which is the second part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is basically a three-point sermon, and Jesus' first point is his midrash. Midrash was a rabbi's explanation of the Old Testament. His second point, or second part, is his Halakha. A Halakha was a rabbi's application of the Old Testament to everyday life. His third point is his Haggadah. A Haggadah was a rabbi's illustration of the Old Testament. We haven't gotten to that yet. We're in Jesus' second point, which discusses 5 things. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, Jesus teaches us to examine the motives of our heart, especially when it comes to religion and our religious practices. In Matthew 6, chapter 6, verse 19, verse 24, Jesus teaches us to point our hearts towards heaven and not toward the earth. In Matthew 6, 25 through 34, Jesus teaches us to make God the ultimate priority of our lives. By doing so, he tells us that we will get in this life everything that we need. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, Jesus teaches us to stop pointing the finger. In other words, stop playing the judge and jury in other people's lives. Max Lucado writes in his book, In the Grip of Grace, "Is there anything more delightful than judging others? There is something smug and self-satisfying about donning the robe, stepping behind the bench and slamming down the gavel." But Jesus says, don't do it. Don't do it. Let's read it together. This is Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. "Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with much judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces." In verse 1, Jesus tells us not to judge others. Now, the idea of judging means don't be critical and condemning of others. He tells us why in verses 2 through 5. In verse 2, he tells us that we will be judged by the same standard that we use to judge others by. In other words, we will get what we give. Now stop and think for a moment. What if you or I were judged by the way that you and I have been judging others? How would it go for us? I think if we're all honest, we'd be like Job in Job 40, verse 3. It says, after God had answered Job's complaints, and Job was judging God, he said, "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth." This verse found here in Matthew chapter 7 really should help us and encourage us to put our hands over our mouths, because it's not a good thing to judge others, because we will be judged by the same standard that we judge others. And not only is judging being critical of others, and that's not a good idea, nor is it a good idea to look at the speck in their eye while we don't consider our own. Jesus calls this being hypocritical. And that's the point that Jesus is making when he says, when you look at the speck at your brother's eye, he says you're playing a hypocrite because you haven't looked at the plank in your own. Now, when Jesus uses the word hypocrite, he's using a word that meant to put on a mask. It referred to what actors in the theater did at his time. To play different parts in a role, the same actor would play different parts, and he would put on a different mask to play a different character, or he would put on a different mask to display a different emotion. Jesus isn't saying that critical people are bad people. He's not saying when we're judgmental we're bad necessarily. He's saying we're being hypocritical. He says we're acting like we are God and everyone else is a sinner. We're acting like we are perfect and everybody else is imperfect. And so he's saying don't do that. Don't play act. Stop acting like you are perfect, and I should stop acting like I'm perfect, because that's what judging others is. It's acting like we are perfect and everyone else isn't. So, but not being critical or judgmental doesn't mean that we suspend all judgment or all discernment. And that's unfortunately what it's come to mean in today's culture. Jesus isn't saying throw out any form of judgment at all and don't be discerning about things, because in verse 6, he goes on to tell us to not give what is holy to dogs, nor to cast our pearls before the swine, lest they trample them under feet and turn and tear us in pieces. What Jesus is alluding to here is something we call discernment. And discernment is judging between things. Both dogs and pigs at the time of Jesus were considered unclean animals in the first century by the Judaism, by the biblical Judaism, and by rabbinic Judaism. And so these terms often refer to outsiders and those that don't have a relationship with God, and that those that are doing things that are not pleasing to God. And the idea here that Jesus is giving us is that though we should not be critical in condemning of others, we still should be discerning. We still need to look at things and make sure that things are right and things are wrong. He's not talking about throwing all judgment away. We have to have a good sense of right and wrong. And he's saying we need to be looking at what other people do in their words and their actions. And we should be looking at whether a person is trustworthy or not. That's really the ultimate context of verse 6 here. William Barclay offers a profound thought in this verse when he writes that the word holy in Aramaic, which is what Jesus would have spoken, is kadash. Now, when it was written only with consonants. So the consonants would be K, D, and SH. Barclay goes on to say that the word for earring in Aramaic is kadasha. But when it's written, it has the same consonants as the word holy, which would be K, D, and SH. Still further, in the Talmud, an ancient Jewish commentary on the oral law, an earring in a swine's snout was a proverbial phrase for something which is out of place. And so Barclay goes on to say, it is by no means impossible that the original phrase ran thus: give not an earring to the dogs, neither cast out your pearls before the swine. Now, in an earlier Digging Deeper moment, we taught that rabbis strung Old Testament scriptures together in something that they called stringing pearls. And so Jesus is telling us here in verse 6, even though you shouldn't be critical, condemning, or exclusive, you should be careful what you say to people. You should be especially careful who you give God's word to, because some people will bite you for it. In other words, don't be critical, but be discerning. If you enjoyed this Digging Deeper moment, pass it on to a friend through email or Facebook. We'll see you next week.